Hello, and welcome to a special edition of Up Close on METV. I'm Charles Clapsaddle, Station Manager for Manatee Educational Television. It's my great pleasure to welcome here today author Bill DeYoung to talk about a very important book that he's written, and also about a couple of other books that are equally important that we're going to take a little time to talk to. Bill, thank you, sir,
Charles,
for coming and taking the time to do this.
It's my pleasure.
When we first heard about this and, we exchanged some emails, I mean, I was fascinated by the scope of, your writing and the two individual books that we're going to talk a little bit about today. But we're going to concentrate on the first book, and that's called SKYWAY, the true story of Tampa Bay's signature bridge collapse.
The true story of Tampa Bay's signature bridge and the man who brought it down. It's very much a profile also of Captain Lero, who was the harbor pilot that day.
Well, we want to get into a lot of detail about this. This bridge, people travel back and forth all the time across the Skyway now. And, that history that occurred in 1980, which I believe people maybe not know all the history about that. And what you've done with your research and all of the depth that you've gone into in this book, it's fascinating. The level of detail is rich and with all of the stories behind the story, so to speak. Now, the Skyway Bridge, as it was even called then, correct?
Sure, oh yeah.
It was built in the 50s.
1954, it went up, it opened Labor Day weekend in 1954. Yeah, it was 3 days of celebration in St. Petersburg.
And I think we have a shot of a part of a celebration.
We're looking
here,
there
some beauty queens.
Acting Governor Charlie John's there with Rika Dialina, who is the reigning Miss Greece. And as I often tell people, history doesn't actually record why Miss Greece was at this ceremony, but there she is. We think it might have had to do with Tarpon Springs, but nobody's ever been able to tell me, but she's definitely there. Each of these bathing beauties has a little cap on. You'll notice they each represent one of the 10 counties that were going to be forever united by this bay-spanning bridge.
And that was in the 53, 54?
This was 1954, yeah. And Acting Governor Johns was there. The reigning politicians of the day were there. The senators from Florida, the head of the road board. There was a World War II hero there who's from Florida. James Milton, the opera singer, who was a Floridian, was there and sang. And they had a big whoop-de-doo ceremony. And then they all crossed the bridge and did it again in Manatee.
A significant achievement because it tied together Hillsborough, tied together Manatee County across a great span, engineering feat. And I would imagine at that time, the engineering capabilities that went into building that bridge was significant.
Well, before this, you crossed Tampa Bay on a ferry, the Beeline ferry boat. You'd put your car on this boat. It took about 45 minutes. And they said for many years it can't be done. You can't put a bridge over this bay. You can't put a bridge over the shipping channel. They couldn't do a tunnel in Tampa Bay because you can't do that in Florida with the limestone underneath. And so yeah, it was kind of a marvel for its time. This was the first bridge in the world to be constructed of what they call pre-stressed concrete, where they had rebar steel rods inside the concrete. So it was very much an experiment that worked.
And it was very successful. And it was very successful, and it opened up commerce and transportation between the two areas, and not only as a feat of engineering, but just as a simple means of transportation. It really opened up the state. It
really did. I think that when you look back at the newspapers and the coverage that it got, the St. Petersburg Times, as it was called then, was a big proponent of this bridge from the very beginning. They had a 15-section, 5-pound edition that came out the day that the bridge opened, and I've seen it, and it's almost entirely advertising for Bradenton, Sarasota, Venice. It was basically they were trying to open up, as you say, commerce down here. It had a lot to do with that, and opening up an artery for US 19 to go further south into 41. It was, you know, transportation. The times it was progress in those days.
And it was. I mean, it was, you know, just after the war, but you know, a lot of money was going into infrastructure, and this was a significant achievement. So let's take a look at this next slide here. And this is the approach?
This is opening day. This is taken from the Manatee side. That's actually the motorcade.
Going from Pinellas to all the dignitaries.
Yes, but I love this picture because it gives one the sense of scale of this bridge.
It's impressive.
Just how monstrously huge it was. We should point out that it rises. This particular bridge rose to 150 feet over the water, and that's to accommodate the shipping channel from the Gulf of Mexico to the Port of Tampa. It's 40 miles from the Gulf to the Port of Tampa, and the only way in is directly across Tampa Bay, which is only 12 or 13 feet deep. So they dug this channel, and the cars had to go right over the shipping channel.
You know, and I think that's a significant point that you point out. The whole Tampa Bay, it's 12 to 13. It's not a deep channel to begin with. And, you know, for some of the larger boats that are in there, it's a significant challenge.
Well, that's one of the reasons that you have the harbor pilots, because let's say you're bringing a ship in from China or somewhere in the South Seas or India, anywhere in the world. You can't be expected to know exactly where everything is here. There's a spider web of channels once you get in towards the port.
Exactly.
That's why you hire a local pilot to come on board and take your ship in.
And that's you know, these pilots are well trained, they're well versed, they're very professional, and they know the intricacies of the channel as they attempt to navigate.
Exactly, because they do it over and over and over again. Now, it's not like driving a car, these big ships, which can weigh up to, you know, 100,000 tons, especially now in the container ship era. I mean, in the 50s, they weren't nearly as big as they are now, but it's still tricky business.
It's a very tricky business, and I think even, you know, before the crash occurred, I mean, these were significant sized ships. I mean, they were there with a lot of weight. And this next photo that we're going to look at, Bill, indicates the vessel itself as it struck the bridge. And give us, if you can, a little background about what it was occurring that day.
Well, in 1971, we should preface this.
Probably go back.
They opened a second span, because the traffic was increasing. A lot of it had to do with Disney World and the blossoming of Orlando. They wanted to make the Sunshine Skyway Bridge part of the interstate system. You had to be 4 lanes. The old bridge was only 2 lanes. So instead of interesting decision on the road board's part, let's say, or Governor Burns, instead of tearing down this aging structure that was 2 lanes and building a contemporary 4-lane bridge, they just built another one. They just dug the blueprints out of the drawer and set up another one right next to it.
And made it kind of a duplicate.
Kind of a duplicate, and so the span that was on the Gulf side went from the north to the south, and the old one sent traffic from Bradenton, Sarasota, up to Pinellas County. Now, this photograph, we're looking at May 9, 1980. It was Mother's Day weekend. Those of us who lived here at the time, like I did, will never forget that day. It's very much our own sort of, you know, Kennedy assassination kind of memory. Where were you when this ship, which was 606 feet long, 20,000 tons.
20,000 tons.
20,000 tons, that's light. There was nothing in it. It was coming into Tampa to take on phosphate. Okay, so it was light. The harbor pilot was John Laro from the Harbor Pilots Association. He'd gotten on about an hour before, just as it was coming in. It's an amazing thing what they do. They have to board these ships while they're moving. They won't stop, because time is money in the shipping business. So the pilot boat has to deliver the pilot by pulling up right next to the moving ship.
He climbs
and
aboard.
He climbs that rope ladder. That's nerves of steel. That's some tough stuff. There's been guys killed doing that. So John and his co-pilot, Mr. Atkins, are on board this ship, and keeping it well within the shipping channel. When the weather turned, they were less than a mile from the Skyway Bridge when the weather turned.
Let's talk a minute about what time of day was this?
7:30 in the morning.
So, you know, you have, I would suppose at that time, you have traffic on these bridges, rush hour, you know, people coming back and forth, you know, both ways in direct 7:30. And at that point, you know, you have a squall line that's coming through, you know, heavy rain, you know, but nothing that serious.
There was no warning that day from the National Weather Service. They said, you know, winds are light to moderate, you know, sort of be watchful, you know, and the pilots and these guys who work this line are very, very acutely aware of the weather forecast. And we have it for the night before and for the morning. They didn't even forecast this thing. It came in so suddenly and so violently that Captain Lero, nobody expected it.
Now this unexpected weather anomaly, they call it a macro burst.
A macro burst,
and which is heavy wind, heavy rain in a very small yet concentrated area.
Very concentrated.
And there's no way to predetermine when this is going to happen. It's just a freak of nature.
It just rides along in the squall and decides, however they decide these things in macro burst land and weatherland, to just go. And so the wind changes direction. We're talking wind bursts of 75 to 80 miles an hour. And this all happened in a 2-minute span of time between the time they were a mile from the bridge and the time they had to pass underneath it.
And that's a critical thing, as you mentioned, you know, when we were talking earlier, is that, you know, and when you're a pilot, a professional pilot like Captain Lero was, you have to make decisions instantly.
Absolutely.
And those decisions have consequences which have to kind of roll into one another.
Down the line.
And these decisions are being made. So here we have this macro burst occurring, 80-mile-an-hour winds occurring, and you're caught in the channel. And this ship, which by the name was
Summit Venture,
the Summit Venture, under the control of Captain Lero and his co-pilot, are caught up in it. And even though they're aiming for the center span, what starts to occur?
Well, you have to think, what are your options? What starts to occur is this: almost immediately, it's black outside. I mean, the wind is blowing. And again, those of us who lived here then remember this happening in a very short amount of time. The wind is blowing horizontally. And it would blow very hard from the east and then stop and then blow very hard from the west. And the motorists who are on the bridge, who talk in my book, we have all their depositions, those who survived it, discuss that the weather was just so freaky. So here's what Captain Lero has. He knows the bridge is coming. He can see it. His radar is working fine, and 2 minutes before he's got to make this very tricky dogleg turn. It's an 18-degree turn to stay under the bridge in the channel. The radar goes out. The weather is so bad, suddenly he's got no radar. So he sends a couple of lookouts up to the bow. It's a Chinese-speaking crew. Tell me, report back to me when you see these channel markers that will tell me I need to make this turn, because he knows you can't stop. It takes a mile for one of these ships to stop. He knows that bridge is there. I've got to do something. He can't go this way because he might ground. He might blow broadside into the bridge. He can't turn around in the channel, which is 800 feet wide, because he knows there's a gasoline tanker coming the other way. And he doesn't know where it is exactly because the radio's gone. Everything's gone in a 2-minute span.
So all of these failures, the technical failures, the radar, the radio, everything's gone. So he's operating kind of blind.
Blind.
And you know, in the middle of a squall, middle of a macro burst, downpour, wind blowing, and he's relying upon people on the bow calling out instructions to him. Right.
What happens is, if I may, what happens is within a couple of seconds, he gets a crackling message from the bow, buoy starboard side, which indicates here we are. And right as that happens, Captain Atkins, who's on the radar, said it cleared for one sweep. We're right here. We're exactly where he said we were. Begin the turn now. So Lero says, okay, I've got it. This is the best that's exactly what he said later. I figured this is the best shot I'm going to have. Okay, so he starts the 18-degree turn. What's happening is the wind is changing direction, so it starts to blow. This is a very light ship. 20,000 tons is very, very light, especially with wind gusts like this. It starts to blow it south out of the channel. So he's making this turn, and you can see it here. He's making this turn to go over here, but it's blowing him that way. And just clipped, well, it's this one.
Well, let's go to the next slide here, which is the impact. You can see the devastation that
1,300 feet of bridge fell. And yeah, it was pretty terrible. And Captain Atkins described it to me just as, did we do that? You know, they're 500 feet back in the wheelhouse on top of the superstructure.
And with all the rain and things,
the rain almost immediately starts to stop, by the way. And so they can see it very clearly. Lara talks about the sun's just starting to come out. And they're standing there watching cars fall off the brake.
And here's another shot, if you could, Bill, talk about that. You can see the superstructures remain, but from the height of the bridge down to the approach, it's pretty well gone. It toppled. 1,300 feet of bridge collapsed.
Right. This is a pretty good illustration of exactly what happened. This is where the bridge was broken by the impact, by the bow of the ship. This is 53 feet above the water line. That's the scale we're looking at here. And there's the bridge, and that's Dick Hornbuckle's 1976 Buick Skylark, which stopped 14 inches from the edge.
14 inches.
14 inches, and he and his friends, it was 4 old guys who were kind of on a day trip.
I think we might have another.
Yeah, that's from his perspective. They got out to safety. So let's be sure that folks know that they would have been the last car over.
But unfortunately, even though that individual escaped out of a dangling vehicle, there were a number of casualties, and I think chief among those was probably the bus that went over.
Yeah.
And the bus had how many passengers?
26, including the driver. There were 26 souls on board. And, well, I mean, that pretty much tells the story. They didn't have a chance.
Unexpected, in the middle of a major rainstorm, major squall. As it hit and it impacted the thing, it collapsed, and all traffic went into the water.
It was 7 vehicles, including this bus. And the very first car, if we go to the next picture, I can tell you the very first car was Wes McIntyre from Gulfport. And that's him. Mr. McIntyre was the only survivor out of the 36 people who went into the water.
This is his vehicle?
That's his vehicle.
Oh.
Now, his story is very, very dramatic. The bridge started collapsing while he was on the very top of it. He talked about suddenly being shoved to the side and kind of skidding down that side, flew off the end as the bridge was falling, and ricocheted off the hull of the ship and sank to the bottom of the shipping channel. Okay. Now, Wes, God love him, had been a swimmer in the Navy during World War II. So he knew how to hold his breath.
Good for him.
He was 59 years old at the time.
Good for him.
So he kicked his way out. He realized where he was, and he got up to the surface. And
Good for him.
That's how he survived. Nobody else survived at all.
And the total number of casualties was?
35.
35
total.
people, most of them on the bus.
26 people on the bus, and then 9 other unfortunates with the cars.
It's really a series of unfortunate, and it all happened within the space of
2 minutes.
2 minutes.
2 minutes, it was all over.
And there's nothing that the drivers could have done to help prevent that. They didn't see it coming. There was no other thing. The impact collapsed the bridge, and whatever was on the span at the time went into the water.
Pretty much. The thing is, too, that angle was so steep of that bridge. It's a bit less steep now. That was one of the improvements they made.
Yeah. Well, here's
you couldn't see the top.
Yeah.
As you were coming up, as you were starting to crest
on the approaches.
Yeah. You just as you were scaling that 5-degree incline, you couldn't see. So these people, the bus driver, apparently, I think he hit his brakes. I think they said they found that out, but you couldn't see. Mr. Hornbuckle was really lucky because he was going slow because somebody else had stopped. Was going very slow as he came up, and then he saw it and he skidded.
Stable to stop right on the.
There's one more picture of Mr. McIntyre, I think, that after this one that I'd love to talk about because his story is central to my book. That's him and his wife Betty there on the left. They visited Summit Venture during the Coast Guard hearings the next week while it was in dry dock. And Betty made a little cake there. On one side it says thanks in English, and on the other side it says thanks in Chinese. And that's Captain Lou of Summit Venture there, and members of his crew. They took the McIntyres on a tour of the ship. And nobody had ever developed the photographs. When I met Betty McIntyre, Wes has passed away a long time ago, but she gave me the negatives and said, see what's in here. And there's this whole series of photographs of Wes standing proudly at the wheel. And it was a little macabre, but
but again,
was good for him, I guess.
having survived that, I think it's nice to to recognize the people who are part of it. Now, key to this collapsed is the story of the boat pilot. And I believe this is a close-up of him.
That's John Lehrer, yeah.
And Mr. Lehrer, relatively young man, but highly regarded in the field, and well thought of, a professional, been doing it for a number of years. But his story in itself is kind of tragic.
It is, because John was from New York, and as were some of the other pilots who came in eventually, and from around the country. But in the old days, in the earlier period, nepotism was kind of rampant in the ranks. Before it was regulated by the government, I could hire my good buddy Charles Clapsaddle and your nephew if you wanted. You could.
Do you want to be a pilot?
Yeah, you had good money in that, son. So, in 1975, the Florida legislature created a piloting board to hire pilots to go around the nepotism thing. And John Lehrer was the first one hired under this new law. So he had 3 strikes against him. The good old boys didn't like him too much. But he wasn't the best pilot they had. Let's put it that way. There were 18 pilots on the bar in 1980. He wasn't the worst. When you see their accident reports, pilots clip things all the time. It happens.
Size of those ships is
it happens. But he was very conscientious, and all the things that were said about him in the media at the time were, I guess, understandable, but nonetheless incorrect, and in retrospect, very cruel. In college in New York, John had been a ballet dancer. He studied at the Martha Graham School of Dance. This is 1980, Charles, so they called him homosexual. They called him an alcoholic. How could this drunk jerk hit this bridge and kill all these people? John Lehrer didn't drink. John Lehrer didn't even drink coffee. And he was a professional. He wasn't drunk out there. He was given a hand that nobody could win.
Right. It was the worst of a situation. However, during this, after the collapse, there were several investigations, many investigations, of which Lehrer was, he was like the prime suspect, so to speak. And because there is a tendency, to want to blame someone.
Exactly right.
For something that happens. Despite the fact, so you had this massive storm, it was a set of circumstances, but there always is. People are always on the lookout for a scapegoat, and Lehrer suffered a lot through that.
It ruined his life. It really did. His wife left him. He was estranged from his 13-year-old son for quite a while. Everybody, it seemed, except for his lawyer, that's Steve Yared there, his lawyer, who's still around today and a very nice fellow, and worked on the book, helped me with the book. Everybody turned on him. What happened ultimately, if I may, is that John had to fight to get his license back. He was exonerated, by the courts. And once they decided about the macro burst, and it was proven in court that this is what happened, that, as the other pilot said, anybody in that position would have done exactly what he did. Got his license back, and then developed multiple sclerosis, and from which he suffered for the rest of his life. He had to give up his pilot's license because he couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't climb those ladders anymore. And so, it ruined his life.
Well, and in your book you go into a lot of detail about his life and what he went through. Not only because there were several investigations. There's the Coast Guard and other boards.
The National Transportation Safety Board. Yeah, it's very thorough.
It's a very thorough, and it came out with that. And I think the detail in your book about Mr. Lehrer gives you kind of an insight into the individual and how not only how he felt about it, but the fact of the matter is that there's nothing he could have done to prevent it.
He spent the rest of his days going over and over and over this in his mind, constantly. John was a Catholic, and the way I understand it, guilt kind of goes with the territory. So he blamed himself, and it was basically a self-punishing thing for the rest of his life.
And it is a tragic story. But out of the loss of life and the tragedy of that and the collapse of the bridge, there came out of this bridge.
A new bridge?
And incorporated, and that took several years
making. It opened in April of 1987. Initially, it's so funny when you read the news reporting of the day. I mean, initially they were going to rebuild it. And that's going to take 4 or 5 years. And it was Governor Graham who told me in this book, he said, I realized that people were going to have to be driving over this every day and reminded every day of what had happened. And then he said, and frankly, it was a pretty ugly bridge in the first place. So it was his decision. He got it approved to bring in an entirely new design, which is called a cable-stayed bridge. It was a design that he discovered in France over the Breton River. They made quite a few improvements. It was moved to the, well, let's see, what direction is that, Bill? That would be to the west, 1,000 yards.
Right.
And to straighten out that dogleg turn.
And I think that was a critical thing that that you
It was. The pilots had a lot to do with this. And you see the bumpers, we all know what those are for, to keep ships out.
And which is, they incorporate a lot of other features, but also a lot of technology into the new bridge and the new bridge design.
Yes.
And finally, there is the shot of your book cover with that vehicle dangling precariously on the edge there.
That's a single photograph. I always try to remind people that that's not a composite or anything. That is one photograph.
It couldn't come any closer.
Yeah.
It couldn't come. And the photo of the ship in the background clearly just as it impacted the bridge, it's just significant. This is a very deeply researched book. You put a lot of time and a lot of effort into it, not only with the interviews that you've had with the people throughout the story, but also in the research that you did into the level of detail of depositions and news articles and reports. There's a lot of detail, but it's kind of like a little mystery, but you know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
But you uncover so many things within the book.
Well, I kind of wanted to focus on the human aspect.
Right, exactly.
Because there was a lot of the news reporting, some of which hasn't aged very well because there were errors and stuff that it was very technical. They didn't focus on, well, what really happened to Captain Lyra? What really happened to Wes McIntyre? What really happened to Dick Hornbuckle in the yellow car? And so I got as close as I could, just kept digging.
And I think I would highly recommend, people, this is a unique Florida story. It's a very unique Florida story. Florida storms, everybody's been through them. They know what they're about. But at the same time, it's epic in the size of it that a bridge collapsed, 35 people plunged to their death. And because of that, new designs, new safety measures were put in place that something like this could never occur again. And before we wrap up today, Bill, I'd like to tell you, first of all, I want to talk a little bit about Bill's other book that we're going to have another program on, and it's called Phil Gernhardt, Record Man. It's a great story. Recently, the Sarasota Herald Tribune did a great story about this and about the book. But if you're into music and about the history of music, this is a great read. And we're going to invite Bill back to do another insightful discussion about that, because it's you really want to talk about the music industry. This is a great story. Give us a little recap.
Well, it's another Florida story. Phil Gernhardt was from Sarasota, and he was a self-made record producer in the 1960s and 70s who became very, very successful in Los Angeles and later in Nashville. But his earliest successes really were in the Tampa-St. Pete area with the Royal Guardsmen and Snoopy versus the Red Baron. Huge record. And Abraham Martin and John. DeYoung, yes, Phil produced that. And that song was written by Dick Holler in Phil's office in St. Petersburg. And on and on. And Lobo and the Bellamy Brothers and Jim Stafford were all discoveries of Phil.
And I can't wait to get into some of the details, because, again, the level of research and the level of detail that you included in that book, equals what you did for SKYWAY. Now, both of these books, and I highly recommend SKYWAY for not only people who are interested in Florida history, but Florida stories, but also, for a true story of epic proportions.
I wish it didn't have to be written, it's a tragedy, but at least it's all there if anybody wants to find out what really
Bill,
happened.
I would say, this is kind of the definitive book on that, on the bridge collapse. It really is definitive. The level of detail in it is wonderful, but it's also a very human story too, because you tell a lot of great human stories. And both of these are available from your website. Is that correct?
Well, the website will link you to Amazon.
Oh, okay.
I'm not really a retailer.
And that's great.
Well,
Amazon was fine to deal with.
Yeah.
So, but if you went to to Amazon and typed in SKYWAY by Bill DeYoung or Phil Gernhardt, record band, they would be. But you also have a website as well, and that is?
That is BillDeYoung.com.
And we're going to put that up on the screen so people can access that as well.
It's got a lot of my music journalism from years gone by on there.
And finally, this is the one shot that I think is very significant. Tell us about this.
During my research for SKYWAY, I discovered that the state of Florida kind of pretended it never happened. You know, it's kind of a black mark on it. Not really a black mark, but, you know, unfortunate, unpleasant. And what we discovered was that there was no marker and no memorial. There was nothing. There was no sign or plaque you could go to that said this happened. So I found out how to get one made, and we crowdsourced it. It cost us $10,000.
No kidding.
And this memorial, we had it. We got state permission, and we put it up in the North Pinellaside Rest area, not far from the memorial to the Coast Guard Blackthorn. And this is right by the fishing piers, which are, as you know, the old SKYWAY Bridge.
The old SKYWAY. That's
and so we had a big ceremony on the 35th anniversary. Mayor Kreisman came and spoke.
Yeah.
We had about 250 people, including victims, family members from all over the country.
And you know, it's a very simple but elegant memorial, and you know, it really pays homage to those people who unfortunately lost their life during that tragic accident.
This needed to be done, and I'm very proud of this.
And you know, again, you were the kind of the forefront of getting this done, and kind of led the charge on recognizing the significance of it. Yeah. So, Bill, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you about. I highly recommend this book. It's a great book. It's a great read. You know, for anybody interested in Florida history, or just simply, you know, about a really tragic story. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to doing the interview about Phil Gernhardt.
We'll talk some Phil.
Bill,
sure.
And maybe we'll have a couple of music clips as well. Yeah. So, Bill, thank you very much for taking the time to do this, and I really appreciate you, you know, and the work and the effort that went into both of these books. But SKYWAY, again, wonderful book and highly recommended.
Thanks so much.
And thank you for joining us on this special edition of Up Close on METV. Please go to Mr. DeYoung's website or Amazon to find out how you can purchase one of these books, SKYWAY or Phil Gernhardt Record Band. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Up Close on METV.